Ever since I was young, I've been drawn to the enigmatic tales of historical wars. My grandfather, a veteran of World War II, was a silent custodian of many such stories. But until I turned 17, these tales were hidden from me. He always insisted that his stories weren't suitable for young ears, his eyes betraying a hint of fear, as if each memory was a living shadow. One quiet evening, with my parents away, I found Grandpa sitting on our worn-out couch, deeply absorbed in a documentary about World War II. The program narrated the horrors of the war, describing them as the most traumatizing experiences for soldiers. At this, Grandpa scoffed and muttered under his breath, "What about the whispers in the fog?" Intrigued, I asked, "Whispers in the fog, Grandpa?" He turned, almost startled, and then sighed, a signal that he was about to part with a long-held secret. "It was a night like no other," he began, his voice now a vessel of the past. "It was late 1944, in the heart of the war. I was stationed in a remote part of Europe, where the fog could be as thick as wool. That night, I was assigned to patrol a sector of no man's land, alone. The commanders believed a lone soldier could move more stealthily." He paused, lost in the fog of his own recollections. The night was dark, the kind where the moon and stars were smothered by the fog. It was so dense that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. All sounds were muffled, creating an oppressive silence that weighed on your soul. Each step I took was cautious, feeling the ground more than seeing it. His eyes took on a distant look. As I moved through the fog, a strange sensation crept over me. It was as if the air around me was thickening, becoming charged with an unseen presence. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was deathly still. These whispers were different. They were voices, speaking in hushed tones. I leaned forward, hanging on every word. The whispers were disjointed, a jumble of different dialects and languages. Some I recognized, others foreign to my ears. They seemed to be speaking directly to me, yet I couldn't make out the words. It was as if they were communicating something urgent, yet incomprehensible. Grandpa's hands trembled slightly. I remember stopping, trying to focus on the whispers. That's when I heard it. A voice distinct from the rest, speaking in English, but with a heavy German accent. It said, "John, why did you leave us?" My blood ran cold. Nobody in my unit knew my real name was John. I always went by Jack. His gaze was fixed on a point far away. The voice continued, speaking of my childhood, mentioning things only I knew. It spoke of my fear of water, the scar on my knee I got when I was 7, secrets I'd never shared. I was paralyzed, not just with fear, but with a deep sense of violation. How could this entity, this whisper in the fog, know such intimate details of my life? My grandfather took a deep, steadying breath, indicating that his story was far from over. The room, steeped in a solemn atmosphere, seemed to hold its breath as he continued his recollection of that fateful night in no man's land. I had barely recovered from the shock of the personal whispers when the fog seemed to thicken further, he continued. I pressed on, determined to complete my patrol, but with every step, a growing sense of dread filled me. The voices had stopped, but I felt watched. His eyes darkened with the memory. I had reached a particularly dense part of the fog when I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate. They were following me, keeping pace. I spun around, my rifle at the ready, but there was nothing but the opaque mist. The silence returned, mocking my heightened alertness. I could almost feel the chill of that night as he described it. I started to doubt my senses. Was it just the echo of my footsteps? Or was there something else out there with me, shrouded by the fog? The uncertainty was maddening. As I continued my patrol, I noticed something else. An irregularity in the fog, like a silhouette of a man. But as soon as I focused on it, it dissipated. His hands clenched involuntarily. Then, as if the night hadn't been strange enough, I stumbled upon an old trench. It was from earlier in the war, long abandoned. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me back to my unit. But the further I walked, the more I felt a presence, something in the trench with me, moving silently alongside. Grandpa's voice lowered to almost a whisper. I remember stopping, trying to listen over the pounding of my heart. That's when I heard it. A whisper, different from the earlier ones, right next to me. It said, "Lost like you." I spun around, rifle ready, but again, there was nothing. He paused, his eyes reflecting a haunted past. The trench seemed endless, the walls closing in on me. I began to run, the feeling of pursuit growing with every step. It felt like a chase, but when I finally emerged from the trench, gasping for air, I realized I was alone. There was no one there, no footprints, no sign of another living soul. He looked at me, his face etched with the imprints of that night. His gaze drifted away, lost once again in the murky depths of his past. The room felt colder, as if the fog he spoke of had seeped into its very walls. As I moved on from the trench, the air grew icy, biting into my skin. He continued, his voice a mere echo of itself. The fog seemed to swirl with a life of its own, forming shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was just the fog playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it was something more. He paused, swallowing hard. Then I heard it, the sound of a child crying, soft and distant. It was surreal, impossible. There were no civilians here, certainly no children. I moved towards the sound, my training forgotten, replaced by a desperate need to help, to find this child. His eyes narrowed, reliving the moment. The crying grew louder, more anguished. I finally reached a small clearing in the fog, and there, in the center, was a figure of a small boy, his back to me. "Hey, kid!" I called out, but he didn't respond. As I stepped closer, the air grew unnaturally cold, and I felt a chill that sank deep into my bones. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. I reached out to touch the boy's shoulder, and as my hand made contact, he turned around. But it wasn't a child. It was a grotesque mask of a face, eyes hollow and black, mouth gaping in a silent scream. I stumbled back in horror, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure dissolved into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. Grandpa's face was ashen as he recounted the event. I ran blindly, my only thought to escape that nightmare. The fog around me churned violently, whispering voices rising into a cacophony. Shadows twisted and turned in the mist, forming faces of people I once knew, friends who had fallen in battle, their eyes accusing, their mouths twisted in pain. He drew a shuddering breath. Suddenly, I tripped over something solid. Scrambling to my feet, I saw it was a fallen soldier, his uniform like mine, but his face, it was a void, an endless abyss that seemed to pull me in. I felt a searing pain in my head, as if my very thoughts were being drawn into that void. The fog, dense and unyielding, seemed to close in around me. He began again, his voice now a mere murmur. I had thought I was alone, but I was gravely mistaken. There, amidst the shrouded landscape, something stirred, a creature not of this world, but born from the darkest depths of nightmare. He shuddered at the recollection. It first appeared as a mere shadow, a darker patch within the fog. But as it drew closer, its horrific form became clear. Towering over me, it was a grotesque mockery of nature. Its skin was a patchwork of rot and decay, its limbs long and twisted, ending in claws that scraped the ground. Grandpa's eyes widened with fear. Its face, though, was the most terrifying aspect. It had eyes, red and glowing, set deep within a skull-like visage. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with some ungodly ichor. The creature let out a guttural roar that shook me to my core. He paused, his breath ragged. Overwhelmed by primal terror, I ran, The creature gave chase, its heavy footsteps thundering behind me. Each roar it emitted was like the sound of doom, urging me to push my exhausted body beyond its limits. The woods became a blur as I sprinted, dodging trees and leaping over roots. His voice trembled. The creature was relentless. I could hear its ragged breathing, feel the ground tremble with its every step. Branches tore at my skin, but the fear of what lay behind me spurred me on. I didn't dare look back. The terror of seeing that monster again might have stopped my heart. Grandpa's gaze was distant, reliving the horror. Then, as sudden as it had begun, the chase ended. I stumbled into the clearing of our camp, the first rays of dawn piercing the fog. I collapsed, my body and mind at their limits. My comrades found me there, unconscious, with wounds they attributed to the harsh terrain. He looked at me, a haunted expression on his face. I was honorably discharged shortly after. They said it was due to nervous exhaustion, but it was more than that. It was the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond understanding. Horrors that lurk in places forgotten by time and sanity. As he finished, the atmosphere in the room slowly lifted, the oppressive weight of his tale dissipating. I sat there, stunned, realizing that the true horrors of war are sometimes beyond human comprehension, manifesting as tangible nightmares that haunt the edges of reality. Years have passed since my grandfather shared that harrowing tale of his encounter in the fog during World War II. The world around me has changed, grown more modern, but the echo of his story lingers in the corners of my mind, timeless and haunting. Grandpa passed away not long after he told me about the beast in the mist, leaving behind a legacy of bravery and a glimpse into the unfathomable horrors he faced. His story, though deeply personal, resonated with a universal truth about the scars of war, both seen and unseen. Sitting in my study, surrounded by books and mementos of a life long lived, I often find myself drifting back to that night. The way Grandpa's voice trembled as he recounted his tale, the distant look in his eyes, it all comes back to me in vivid detail. It's in these quiet moments that I feel a connection to him, a deeper understanding of the man he was, shaped by experiences far beyond the ordinary. As I've grown older, I've delved into history, trying to understand the context of Grandpa's encounter. I've read about the psychological effects of war, the stories of soldiers grappling with unseen enemies, and the folklore that sprung from the battlefields of history. Yet, nothing quite compares to the raw intensity and personal truth of Grandpa's narrative. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, when the world is shrouded in a soft mist, I venture out. The fog, with its eerie, swirling tendrils, always brings me back to his story. I can almost hear the faint whispers, the sound of something otherworldly stirring in the depths of the mist. It's in these moments that I feel closest to Grandpa, as if he's right there with me, sharing in the silent understanding of his encounter. I've often wondered about the creature he described. Was it a figment of war-induced stress, a manifestation of his deepest fears? Or was it something real, something that defies explanation, lurking in places where reality thins and the unknown seeps through? These questions, I fear, will remain unanswered, lost to the passage of time. Grandpa's story has become a part of me, a haunting reminder of the unseen battles that many carry within them. It's a tale that I now hold in trust, a legacy of a soldier who faced more than just the enemy on the battlefield. In the end, it's a testament to the enduring human spirit, a spirit that, even in the face of unimaginable horrors, finds the strength to endure and to tell the tale. As the years pass and the world changes, the echoes of that night in the fog remain, a melody that plays softly in the background of my life, a tribute to a brave soul who once faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the story.